Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Voxology Podcast. My name is Mike Erre. I'm here with my friend, cohort, brother-in-arms, comrade in battle, Timothy John Stafford. Whoa. We are delighted that you are tuning in today. We've got some things for you. First, some housekeeping. Timothy. Yep, housekeeping. Number one, I want to thank Jennifer, Trenton, and Karen because they came on the Patreon team. And so, wow, and thank you. And you all, I'm learning the Southern phrase, you all are amazing. This whole community is amazing.
You know, on old radio shows, they had the guy with the keyboard that
whenever
it had the sound effects.
Yeah. We need one of those.
Yeah, the Owen Wilson going wow. Or
wow. Wow. Yeah, so thank you guys very much. And if you want to join us, go to patreon.com and you can type in Voxology Podcast and find us there. And then someone emailed in. Yeah, and show notes. Absolutely. And someone emailed in and said, hey, I don't want to do Patreon, I want to do something else. And so there's a Tithely link, but it's not on the Voxology Podcast. So you have to go to Tithely, and it's literally tithe.ly, and type in Vox Christian Community, and that's how you find us there.
Yeah.
But you have to make easier. Yeah, we do have to make that easier. So, but anyway, that's how you find us. So thank you very much. Secondly, we're going to send out a survey here in the next couple of weeks, and we need email addresses. Now, people have emailed us their email addresses, or they've asked for a link to the survey on Facebook. But the most helpful thing, the most Jesus-honoring, helpful thing would be to, right now, go on your mobile device, go to voxologypodcast.com, and at the very end, just put your email in there. We're not going to spam you. What we're going to do is we carry a bunch of assumptions about our audience after 6 years into our conversations, and we want to check those against reality. And we're very curious about some things that we're thinking about sort of exploring. And it would be a great gift if you'd be willing to do that. I know it's a bit of a pain, but it would be a great gift.
So I'll put that in the show notes too, where you can go to the website and sign up.
Yeah, why don't we put that on Facebook? Why don't we put that on all the socials? Just, that would be great. Thank you, Timothy.
Oh yeah.
Wow. Seth Theory at school today, fired up. He was bummed that he was not going to star on the Voxology Podcast, but he made sure that we were going to talk about his life. He said, Daddy, talk about my life? I said, yes, absolutely. So Seth is hitting puberty, and that is just a whole bunch of new conversations around the house for us. I'm going to stop it right there. That is the Seth update. So anyway, a couple of things after housekeeping. Today, we have a really fun interview that I've been looking forward to. So Tim Gombis is our friend.
And, Tim Gombis.
Tim. He recommended, last April, a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And it's written by an historian who shows how our concept of biblical womanhood is nothing more than just cultural readings placed upon the Bible.
Yeah.
And
what's the subtitle?
How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth.
Yes.
Right. And how, it's a doozy. And she is so humble. She includes so much of her own story and struggle in this book. And so we have been trying to get her on the show since Gombis first told her about it, and today we did it, Timothy.
That's right.
And I want to remind people about why we care so much about this topic. If you've been a listener, this is a topic we revisit, the idea of women in leadership and the women being freed in all areas of leadership and giftedness in the church and outside of the church. And the reason it's been very important to us, well, for me, I grew up in a conservative environment where male headship was taught, modeled. Men were the spiritual leaders of the household. I was involved in campus ministries where, if you were in a dating relationship, the man always initiated, the man defined the relationship, the man, declared the sexual boundaries. It was up to the man to kind of initiate, and the woman's job.
Poisonous on both
sides. The woman's job was to respond.
Yeah.
I was in marital counseling where my role was the spiritual leader of the house. And and it's just jam packed. And then you take this into church. Women are not allowed to preach, but they're gifted. So we'll let them teach or share, or go on the mission field and do this. But we won't let it happen here. And
you can preach overseas.
Yes, exactly. With the people that aren't us. And I was in churches where I was leading, where I was uncomfortable with that status quo, but I wasn't just aware of biblical scholarship that took those passages, like in Timothy or in 1 Corinthians, that took them very seriously, but then also showed, well, that's not the only way to read them, let alone maybe the best way to read them. And it wasn't until I was pastoring a church and they did not allow women to serve communion, and I just asked the board of elders, okay, show me the verse where women can't serve communion. And, their answer was very honest, and they were very gracious. They just said, well, it's probably more just a cultural thing than anything else. Oof. And you just realize, I think so this idea that there is no such thing as biblical manhood or womanhood, and that those are, you can trace it historically. Those are constructs read into the text, used and weaponized in culture war. It is awful. It is horrific. And we want to stand just against all of that horse crap, because it's not true. It's just not true. One of the biggest things was learning that Proverbs 31, the Proverbs 31 woman.
Yeah.
All the feminine imagery in Proverbs, whether the adulteress or the faithful spouse, all of that's concerning wisdom or foolishness. Right. It's never about wives and faithful ones versus non-faithful ones. And so there was this Proverbs 31 woman, that ideal that was held up, when I was younger, and you realize, that's just so not it. And so anyway, there have been several books. Amy Bird has come up with a book called Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood.
Right.
Kristen Dumais has written a book called Jesus and John Wayne that shows how that biblical masculinity is just a construct. And then this book is really showing how biblical womanhood is just a construct, that you can, that it's just another way of reflecting the same old patriarchy that has been true in human history. Now we've Christianized it and made it a gospel issue. And so it's a really good book, but she turns out to be like our friend Amy Jill Levine, just a dynamo.
Yeah.
And such a fun interview. So I would encourage you, even if you're somebody who holds what we would call a complementarian perspective, which is that women, that women are equal, but they don't have the same sort of function in the church, that they're gifted differently and called differently than men. There's still some good stuff here that I think we need to wrestle with. And if you're a young lady who is somebody who has been taught this sort of ideal, the Proverbs 31, or the gentle, quiet spirit, or the, your job is to respond and kind of keep the home, and that's biblical, you're really there's some stuff to chew on here. If you don't, I would encourage everybody to read the book, but if at least listen to this and take seriously what she says, because again, she was somebody who changed her mind just like I did. She and I were both raised in very similar environments, and you later come to realize, and that's not an issue to me of deconstructing at all. That's an issue of more faithful discipleship.
Absolutely.
This is not, to me, this is not taking the Bible less seriously. It's taking the Bible more seriously, as we've been talking about the whole way. Yeah. So for all those reasons, it was just great to have her on. Tim, what did you think of our conversation with her?
I loved it. This has become a deal breaker issue for me, and we're not attending a church right now, any church, because I can't reconcile this theology anymore. So, and what I thought was really interesting is that she mentioned that the thing that started this process was being in a really rigid church. And that kind of like sparked her pursuit of kind of digging at this stuff. And I was thinking about that because, I've referenced a conversation I had recently with a church trying to figure out where they were with this topic. And it's that line of like, women serve in this capacity and women serve in this capacity. And, we don't call them pastors, but they, definitely they teach the kids and they lead the women's Bible studies and they're deacons and da-da-da-da. But no woman will ever preach no woman will ever preach. Right. And I'm just like, but they build a structure that kind of like keeps everything kind of in the fog.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. If you really push me on the topic, no, women are not equal. But there's all these kind of things that kind of keep people happy, and that is gross. And so I can see how a rigid system could help spur. Yeah. Because she mentions that if she would have been in a more complementarian church where women were still serving, it would have been harder for her to have started that journey. Yeah. And two, I think that I grew up in a similar church, obviously, where women weren't allowed to preach or whatever, but my faith really like started to become an actual thing when I was in Young Life. And Young Life, even though on paper they won't, they will hold the same line as all this other stuff, the particular one that I was in, women were teaching. And so as I began to understand who God was, women were a huge part of that. So it just kind of made the field, it just never made sense after that. Yeah. And I think almost the most wise people in my life have been women. So to say, hey, you're one of the smartest people I know and you carry so much wisdom. However, your lack of a penis is you're gonna have to take a back seat, is just ridiculous. And the third thing is, she mentions her daughter, but me thinking about, my little 5-year-old hurricane, I'm gonna get emotional. Yeah. Yep. Come on. I can't, I'm trying to raise her to not break that spirit in her in life, to put her in a church setting and then tell her that she's less than. It's just stupid, and I won't do it. I don't want her to grow up thinking that God thinks that she can't. Mm-hmm. That God thinks that she's less. That just pisses me off. Yeah. Yeah. And as somebody who has a 16-year-old daughter, let me just tell you that battle is so worth fighting. Yeah. To go. Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I'm only working at a church that has a woman elder, soon to have two, and a woman female teaching pastor. So I'm just completely with you on this. But and it's okay that other people, other places, because we were. Yeah. But I tell you what, man, daughters. Boy, that changes the equation. So to wives too, I wouldn't want my wife. She's one of the smartest people I know. So to say that she, and one of the best leaders I know, to tell her that she couldn't lead, that's just, I don't know. It just doesn't reconcile. So anyway, it's in that kind of tone that we recommend this episode, this interview, and this book. No, I love it, man. Absolutely. This is worth being emotional about, the amount of harm. And off air, she referenced a study, and I think I've read it, but I don't know anything about it, but she referenced it, just a study that was correlating willingness to stay in abusive marriages is much higher in religiously conservative backgrounds. How do you reconcile that to Jesus? I just can't. It's so hard when we talk about there's some stuff in there with race and with gender and different things, and it makes Christianity sound evil. And that's like, that's a bummer that's kind of where we've landed. Yeah, totally. So anyway, hope you enjoy the interview. You guys are amazing, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. So give us a shout out if you would. Take care, and we'll
See you soon. Hey, everybody. We're so glad you're with us. Today, finally, we have a guest that we have been looking forward to talking with, Dr. Beth Allison Barr, who is at Baylor University and has written a book that has sent pretty substantial ripples through the evangelical community about a topic that we care about, which is seeing women released into full leadership and gifting capacities all throughout the church and culture. And she wrote a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And our friend Tim Gombis talked about this months ago. And so we have been joyfully anticipating this conversation. And so, and she's given us, permission to just call her Beth. So Beth, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking time. And she informed us she is recovering from COVID. So that's how much she's committed to this podcast, ladies and gentlemen. And then we found out that we were number 106 out of 127. And realized, okay, so maybe we're not that special, but we're still very excited to have this conversation. So, Beth, can we just start and tell us, if you get tired or anything, can we just start talking a little bit just autobiographically about your background? I mean, what was your inherited culture as you grew up?
Yeah, so I mostly grew up in Texas. My parents are both Texans, although my dad was in the military while he was getting his MD. So we moved around a lot when I was small. But since I was 5, we lived in Texas. And in fact, this morning, one of my old friends sent me a link to my childhood home, which is for sale again. So I was looking through that. So anyway, it's not all that far actually from Waco. I grew up outside of Waco. So so I'm a Texan pretty much through and through. And I grew up in the Baptist church. I grew up in a small town. Not all that many church options, but we did have the major, Baptist church on one corner, Methodist church on the other corner.
Nice.
And so I grew up in the Baptist church, although my father has a lot of Methodist in his background. But I ended up marrying a Baptist minister. So you can say that very much is in my blood.
Yeah.
So this really is my world. I grew up in small town evangelical Christianity. Yeah. And it is not just the faith that I grew up in, the faith tradition that I grew up in, but it is also sort of in the air that I breathed all around me. And even now I'm at a Baptist university.
Totally. What was
still in the air?
What were the messages that you received about womanhood and biblical womanhood and sexuality and all of those sorts of things? I mean, we could imagine, but you go into them a bit in the book, and they're, when you're reading them, you're just kind of shocked by, wow, these are things we actually say.
Oh, yeah. No. So, now that I've had some reflection and have thought back on it, I now realize that I was at the very sort of beginning of what I would call the hard line turn towards gender roles in evangelicalism. And this is really sort of like the rise of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, the rise of the people who eventually joined with the Gospel Coalition, and the beginning of what becomes Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood with John Piper and Wayne Grudem. So I entered high school at the very end of the 80s. And this was right after, as I said, the CBMW was formed. Yep. I didn't know any of this at the time. But what I remember is very early on in my high school career, we had a Disciple Now weekend for our church, which I think was one of the first or the beginning, the prototype of the True Love Wait conferences.
Oh, wow.
And so I wish I knew what the curriculum was, but it was very, very early on in that. And it was the first time that I really remember hearing these ideas that women are their primary calling is to be in the home and to be under male headship. And what was interesting, even though this is the first time I really clearly, heard that articulated, it made sense in my world because I lived in a world where there were a lot of stay-at-home moms. And, VBS ran at our church in the morning because all of the stay-at-home moms were able to do it between, 8 and 12 in the morning. And so it was something, even though there were working moms, the ideal often seemed to be, as I said, it was one of those things where somebody said recently they'd never heard their husband introduced as a working dad. But, the way women were introduced, my friends would say, oh, my mom's a working mom and things like that. And so clearly, that's indicating that there is something anomalous about that. So I grew up in a world where these gender roles were sort of accepted. And it was really, now I know, was sort of Southern tradition, Southern culture. But what we see begin to happen in the late 80s and early 90s is it becomes imbued with Christianity, with sort of this idea that not only is this what we do, this is what we should do as Christian women.
That's right.
And so as I moved through my high school years and into college, those were the messages I got, that as Christian women, this is what we aspire to, and it's under it's following male headship, and it is prioritizing the home and family.
Now, even though that was what you had grown up in, from your story, you were pursuing graduate degrees and professorship, and so how were you able to kind of reconcile that before the light bulb sort of went on in, I think it was 2018?
So it was a gradual progression in my life. But so, part of this, I think a lot of it is my family. My family has a very strong work ethic. And even though my mom was a stay-at-home mom, but part of that was because she was married. She and my dad actually met in medical school. And my dad was in residency when she had, 4 children in under 7 years. And so, some of that was just simply, and in the 70s and early 80s, when she was having children, it was hard for women to work outside the home. This is right after they defeated the ERA. There is childcare is very expensive, especially for babies. It's just it was really hard for working women when they had that many children. And so there were lots of, but that didn't keep her from emphasizing the importance of a vocation for her children. And I'm one of 3. I have 2 sisters and a brother, and all of us have advanced degrees. And all of us, are all of us work. So my sisters as well as myself. And so we had this in our family, was this really strong work ethic. And because these messages in the church didn't really start hitting me until, as I said, it was in high school and going into college, I didn't really make a connection. It was sort of like this idea that as long as you put your family first, you can still work. It's more that priority sort of thing that you do. Yeah. And if you look at sort of the evolution of these ideas, it's not really until the early 2000s that we start getting these messages from people like John Piper and Mark Driscoll that start saying that women not only should put family and home first, but that they shouldn't work outside the home. We start seeing this sort of fringe movement. Before, this had been sort of a fringe movement with Bill Gothard, et cetera, that said women really should stay only in the home. And what we began to see in the early 2000s, it begins to infiltrate into more mainstream evangelical Christianity. Yeah. And so I kind of was on the leading edge of that, where I wasn't getting all of those messages were starting to come to me sort of like after I'd already started doing things. So I was already in graduate school when these messages start becoming harder, that women really shouldn't even work at all. So if that's helpful.
Absolutely. And is that when the cognitive dissonance started pressing you to ask questions about some of that inherited culture, or was it something else?
Yeah, no, it was because my husband, I was at, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in medieval and women's studies program. And,
so awesome.
I know. And my husband was at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary
my goodness,
at the height of Paige Patterson. And we didn't really think about it before he was just going to a seminary, Baptist seminary, that was near where I was getting my PhD. But when he got there, it immediately became clear that there was that what I was doing was not something that was accepted or really approved of by a lot of the people that he was in seminary with. Yeah. And so both of us began to feel this kind of disconnect where he would have to, explain why I was doing what I was doing. And I would often sometimes hide what I was doing. If people asked, I just wouldn't mention what I was doing, or I wouldn't mention the name. I would say, I was in school, and some people would just assume that I was at seminary or doing something like that. And so I just wouldn't tell them I was in a PhD program at Chapel Hill. So we began to feel that pressure pretty early on. And this was early days of our marriage. We got married 10 days before we started grad school. So this was also at the very beginning of our marriage and ministry together, where we start having, as you put, this cognitive dissonance between what we felt God called us to do and what evangelical culture was pressuring us to do.
Yeah. And when was it? You highlight Romans 16 as kind of a turning point. Can you tell us just a little about that? Because what I'm fishing for is there's the dissonance is one thing that kind of presses us into, hey, is this inherited culture really true? But when was the first click that said, oh, maybe we've made this up?
Well, it was long before Romans 16. Okay. It was when I was I very clearly remember the moment because, as I said, when I first began to hear these very clear messages about male headship and that women's priority was family and home, it kind of made sense in the world that I grew up in because, it made sense with the Southern culture I was in. But then as I moved to graduate school and these messages started getting harder, I started realizing, very early on, one of the first papers my husband wrote at seminary was on female ordination, actually. This is when we still accepted the idea of male headship. And the reason he did it was because one of his friends was a woman. She was working on a chaplaincy degree. She worked at a church. And he found out that she was unable to get the scholarship that he was able to get, even though she was Baptist working at a church. And the reason is because she wasn't ordained. And he was like, so she was paying more for school, even though she was doing everything exactly the same as him, simply because she wasn't ordained. And the reason she wasn't ordained was because she was Southern Baptist. They wouldn't ordain her. Yeah. And so he wrote a paper not advocating for women to be able to preach or, be in the pulpit like men, but simply advocating for female ordination so that because of the economic disparity that it created. Yeah. And so, that was one of, it sort of was like, why are we creating these arbitrary rules? Where does this come into the Bible that women's ministry can't be recognized? Right. And which is kind of what ordination does. And so that very early on, and at the same time, as I said, I was in these women's studies courses, and I was in sort of a broad based women's studies course where we kind of read across the global world. The professor teaching it was a medievalist, so we started early and read throughout. And so we read all over the place. And one of the things that I began to think about in that class was how the lessons that we were being taught about what women should be in the Christian church were the same lessons that were being taught to women in the ancient world outside of Christian cultures, that were being taught to women in the Islamic world, that were being taught. And it struck to me, I was like, why are Christians treating women exactly the same as all of these non-Christian cultures? That really was the first time that I was like, what is this? What is coming first? Is this because Christianity somehow has influenced, the Christian God has somehow influenced all of these other areas? Or is it because the world and the way the world does things is influencing the church?
Come on.
And so that was when I began to first ask those questions, was in my women's history seminar.
And one of the things that is fascinating that you get into is that difference that we can read some of the traditional understandings of household codes or Paul's teaching and set it up next to ancient writers and go, yeah, there's absolutely no difference
exactly
here, which is like, okay. So one of the things that's the biggest gift to I think the wider conversation is the idea that biblical womanhood, there's no such thing, that is a construct
exactly
that doesn't challenge culture but just reflects fallen culture.
Yep.
What was that like discerning that? Like, what were, I mean, the book does such a great job, and I don't want to rob anyone from reading the book, but what were some of the milestones as you were treading that ground and realizing, oh my goodness, this, biblical womanhood isn't a thing. What were some of the things, particularly as a historian, that you were noting, that were kind of raising this up?
So, the irony of it is, I think if we had been in a church like what we had grown up in, I mean, the church that we were in was becoming progressively more hardline on this issue while we were there. It didn't start off that way when we started in ministry, but it became progressively more. And so I think if we'd actually been in a church that had, still supported complementarianism, but had been sort of light-handed about it, that, was sort of like, oh, it just means women can't, preach from the pulpit and stuff. I don't know if I would have started questioning it as much, because it wouldn't have, I don't think I would have seen the impact of it as much. And so really this was the being in a church that was becoming more and more hard line on women not being able to be on the stage, women not being able to pray in public, women not being able to teach, Sunday school classes, having the pastor come in and check when I was teaching a class on church history in front of, men would be in the room. He came and checked my notes to make sure I wasn't talking about the Bible, and those things like that, they were sitting, it's like, this is weird. This is weird. And it's especially weird when you're a women's history professor and you're teaching women in the ancient world, which includes women in the early church. And however you write it, Phoebe was teaching the Bible. Yeah. She's reading Paul's letter. I mean, that's just simply a historical fact that you can't get around. You can call her a servant. You can try to pretend that maybe she's not a messenger like the other messengers, that maybe she just carried the Bible and actually didn't read the text, which there's no evidence at all that she would have been any different than any of the other ones who were carrying the letters. You can do all sorts of things to try to write women out of what they're doing in the Bible. But at the end of the day, I mean, what do you do with Huldah? What do you do with Deborah? You can't really write them out of the scripture. And yet
we've tried, right?
We've tried. We have tried really hard. But, I guess as a historian, I mean, that's one of the things is that I knew that regardless of what language we used about women or tried to describe them, I knew what those women were doing. I knew the scholarship, as I said, I've told this to more than one person. In some ways, my book really shouldn't be necessary because there is so much scholarship that has been around for decades, which shows that women have been preaching and teaching and recognized in ministry throughout church history, and that women's roles in the Bible are also, doing the same thing as men, and that Jesus's response to women in the Bible is always, is never supporting patriarchal structures. I mean, Jesus never supports patriarchal structures. I mean, even in the Old Testament, God is often lifting women out of the impact of patriarchal structures. And so it's like, how are we in a church system that is not only enforcing patriarchal structures, but in making them harder and more rigid for women in ways that are not reflected in church history, or anyway, not always reflected, as I said, patriarchies in church history, but nonetheless, but certainly not reflected in the Bible. Yeah. And so those, I think as our church became harder, I began to realize the cracks in biblical womanhood in ways that I might not have if I had been in a church that really was like, women can do everything but be the senior pastor, which is also a stupid thing because there's no senior pastor in the Bible.
Right.
You will not find that role, or even an equivalent role in the Bible, as much as we might try to. You're not going to find it.
One of the interesting bits along those lines is how certain translations have worked to obscure Phoebe's role or Junia. You want to get into that just a little bit in terms of, there are agendas behind translations.
That actually was one of the most surprising things to me about writing this book, was how much people didn't realize this about English Bible translations. In some ways, chapter 5, it was the first chapter I wrote. I wrote it while I was teaching that semester because I was teaching my women's history class. And I actually have a whole thing on Bible translations where we look at the impact of the early modern English Bible and how it is connected to early modern English culture and translating those ideas. I mean, this is something I talk about in all my classrooms. And so it's a very common idea. And I mean, it's very common knowledge, let's say, in the scholarly world. But I'm always struck by how my students are always surprised by it. This is what, they're always surprised by it. And so talking with my students, we often talk about the King James Bible. And so that's, and mostly with it, what we see with the King James and these early modern English translations is that they use very androcentric language, which is male-centered language. So we see them write out places where it would have said brothers and sisters, where we see, medieval sermons saying good men and women, and putting that in. We see the early modern English Bibles, the KJV, writing brothers. And writing men and all male pronouns. And so we see this, and this is also a time when the English language is becoming much more androcentric as it becomes legal. We see the same thing going on in the legal processes. So that's what we focus on in my class, is showing how this language, which is then put into a room where all the translators are men, all of them are highly, are educated men, and they're only talking to other men. And so they write a Bible for men, by men, for men, about men. And then if we take that and fast forward to the 20th century, what we find with the ESV is that pretty much exactly the same thing happened, except for, this is what I think is the difference, is that I think these early modern English translators, I don't know, I think they were just going along with their world. I mean, I don't think they were intentionally writing women out of the Bible. I think they were intentionally making choices about marriage, the way they applied the word marriage, because, it just didn't do to talk about these women who were sleeping with men who weren't married, and it was being okay. So, even though there's no marriage ceremony for Rachel and Jacob, they're married, okay? They go into there's marriage, it's all a wedding, etc. So they have to make that pretty. But the ESV, the whole reason the ESV was born was because they were afraid of gender inclusive language.
Yeah, in the NIV,
in the NIV, and with the TNIV. And then they also were unhappy with the Revised Standard Version because it translated, this was a whole controversy before that in the 70s, it translated Mary as a young woman instead of specifically saying virgin. And of course, the reality is that's actually what the text says. and that the word implies not married, which implies virgin, even if it doesn't say. So it was really just standardizing to what the text actually said. But conservatives like blew up and said that they were saying they were denying the virgin birth, which was, completely out of context. So they were also upset with the RSV over that. But they were really upset with the TNIV, with this influence of what they called gender inclusive language. And so they planned the ESV, which took the RSV. It's about 90 to 95% the RSV. And the places where they changed it are not completely, but significantly areas that are used to enforce male headship and enforce female subordination. And they actually say that. They say that it is unapologetically complementarian, and that their goal was to help emphasize the God's beautiful design. That's not the word they say, but that's kind of, of complementarity between women and men. And so that was the plan behind what they were doing, and they were incredibly successful. And so I think they all hate me right now, but I'm kind of not sad that people are re-examining, at least going to their ESV with eyes wide open.
Absolutely. I remember ESV came out, and Scott McKnight, who is an egalitarian scholar, just went, this thing is absolutely corrupt in a couple of instances where the agenda, and I'm not saying every other interpretation is free from agenda. It's just that in this case, there was and they were upfront about it. And the thing that's striking, though, is so one of the arguments is that biblical womanhood is actually just a construct, and you can trace from ancient Rome and how ancient Rome treated women and how they restricted their freedoms into the medieval period, which is utterly fascinating, into the Reformation and how the ideal sort of Christian woman changed from somebody who was chaste and avoided sexuality to now becoming somebody who was married and had a family and was kind of governing the household. I mean, it's such a huge shift in the idea of what biblical womanhood is. The Reformation was good news for a lot of people, but not women. I'd love to hear talk a little bit more about that.
I'll qualify that. It's funny because I have all these. The Reformation chapter is probably the one I sweated over the most. The Paul chapter, I knew I was going to get. I did sweat over it a lot, and I sent it out to a lot of people, and I got a biblical scholar to read it before because I was like, I'm really. And I also in the Paul chapter, I framed a lot of it as questions, like, let's look. Can we look at this differently? Right. The Reformation chapter really is probably the one I sweated over the most. And in fact, I sent it to another scholar, and I was like, just help me because I know the scholarly debates that I am wading into with this chapter. And I'm having to paint a broad brush. And so I was just like, help me make sure that I said everything, correctly, at least from this broad brush level. And so it was, I was very grateful to friends who helped me out with that. But so the Reformation, the point of the Reformation chapter wasn't so much that the Reformation was bad for women, because, you have to think, we think about this as, we talk about this a lot in women's history, that sometimes women are better off in some circumstances, but that often means that women in different circumstances are worse off. And so it's not that, it's kind of like women, there's a equilibrium where women always remain under male authority. And some women are maybe a little bit better along that, whereas other women are a little worse off. But they're never. That makes sense. They're never equal to. Does that make sense? So it's not that so it's not that it was worse. It was, it elevated women as wives. I mean, this is actually a really good thing. The medieval world didn't elevate women as wives. And in fact, we know, spiritually speaking, the worst thing you could be, spiritually speaking, was a sexually active woman. And so women who were married, even though children was a good thing, It wasn't the best thing a woman could do.
Right.
Yeah, but it wasn't the best thing a woman could do. The best thing a woman could do was to not be sexually active, either as a widow who had committed herself to following God, or as somebody committed to the church. And so, in the Reformation, did elevate that role of women in a way that helped a lot of women. But at the same time, it limited women's opportunities. Whereas in the medieval world, there was a variety of things that a woman could be, to be a godly woman. I mean, even as a wife, you still could, there are things you could do to be a godly woman, even within that confine. But after the Reformation for Protestant women, really the best thing, the way to be a godly woman was to be becoming a wife and a mother.
That's right.
And remaining a wife and a mother.
And that anecdote about how Reformation churches changed the seating arrangements. That is so before the Reformation, men and women would sit separately across from each other.
Yep.
And during and after, the women would sit with the men as kind of a visible sign of their belonging to the man who defined kind of that family.
Yep. I mean, it is, it's striking.
It really is. And it helps paint the picture that is the great gift, I think, of your work, which is there is no biblical womanhood. That that is forcing something on the text. And in this case, in our time period, it's forcing the exact same patriarchy that has existed at all times everywhere back on the text. How did it because your subtitle is just it's so juicy. How the subjugation of women became gospel truth. So there's one thing to say, it's one thing to say, yes, we think the Bible teaches these gender roles. Mm-hmm. It's another thing to elevate that position to be of like most doctrinal importance. Like when you go on certain websites, it's like, this is a gospel issue.
Yep. That's
How did that happen?
Gosh, that's the part, on the one hand, I do think that reading texts that reading the Bible to emphasize male authority and to push women out of leadership positions in the church, I do think that's not an accurate reading of the Bible. At the same time, however, I understand how people can get there, and I'm not really going to go around and try to talk people out of that. What I am going to stand firm on, though, is that however you stand on women's issues, it is not part of the gospel. I mean, that just simply is. It is not part of the gospel. And that is what has happened, is that in the modern evangelical church, complementarians argue that the only correct way to read the Bible is to read male headship and female subjection. And anybody who reads it differently, while they still might be Christian, it leads them on the slippery slope away from the faith. Yep. And so it is dangerous to even hear a woman preach. I mean, think about Russell Moore's article in 2006, which I think he has repented of since then, but nonetheless, where he said Beth Moore was essentially a gateway drug away from evangelicalism, away from the faith, because it leads people down that slippery slope from not being faithful to the text. Yeah. And so this came from, it's like, where did we get this? It certainly comes from inerrancy, the concept of inerrancy, which a lot of people get really upset about. And people all the time, I'll have people all the time who will just send me messages and they'll say, okay, I totally I understand what you're saying and everything, but before I can follow you, tell me, are you an inerrantist? Right. And I'm like, that's the wrong question. Come on. Because inerrancy is not about reading the Bible. We think inerrancy is about being faithful to the scripture. But what inerrancy really is about reading the Bible the way a certain group of white men told us to read the Bible. Totally. I mean, that's really what it is. And inerrancy has nothing to do, I'm sorry, maybe it's my medicine. I love it. But if you look at that's inerrancy isn't about being faithful to the Bible. And so the way I just don't respond to that question anymore. I say, I'm faithful to the Bible. I'm a faithful Christian and I believe in the Bible. So if you're asking me if I believe, yes. Yeah. But I'm not going to answer your inerrancy question because it is a litmus test. And it is a litmus test that I believe was born in the gender wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on a second.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. We just had a whole episode on how inerrancy is the wrong question to ask of the text.
Oh, good. Who did you have that with?
Just us.
These two clowns.
Okay, well, I want to listen to that. I didn't know you had that. I was playing right into what you said.
Oh my goodness, yes. We've done this part series on the Bible. And we were talking about how inerrancy how is a poem inerrant in any, meaningful sense of the word? But that extra step, Beth, that you just took, that inerrancy was born out of the gender wars. Can you give just another couple sentences on that? Because
sure.
I thought it was born, the way I'd always understood it was, particularly in the 70s, it was a reflection of the concern with critical scholarship from Europe and the literary criticism and methods that were being used, and so inerrancy became this sort of bulwark against. Well, they say it has mistakes, we say it doesn't. But I'd never thought to frame it in terms of gender wars. I'd love just if you wouldn't mind just taking us down that rabbit hole a second.
Yeah, no, and I'm not the only scholar to assert that. There is a scholarly argument, about this, like which came first, inerrancy or complementarianism. Wow. And so there is this, but Kristen Dumais, this is one of the things that she also in Jesus and John Wayne, where she also, believes that inerrancy that was part of the gender wars. And so it's also part of racism, of the racial structures. It's born in the early 20th century. It is a reaction to German higher criticism, which did go too far. I mean, they sort of like people who get on the deconstruction train. My graduate students just read Judith Butler yesterday. I don't know if you know who Judith Butler is, but essentially she argues that that all gender is performative and that essentially nothing really exists. Everything is performative. And so it's like, that's a really fun thing to talk about, but we're all really sitting in chairs, and so you can't really deconstruct the chairs that we're sitting on. Yeah. So, German higher criticism was kind of like that. It kind of got on this, sort of like nothing was real in the Bible, and everybody freaked out because this is also the same time as the Darwinian theory about evolution, which provides an alternative vision.
Yeah.
To where the world came from. So people do freak out, and there does begin to be an emphasis. It's like, the Bible is literally true. Everything about it has to be literally true. But the same people who came up with that sort of idea and begin to defend that very rigid understanding of biblical text were also defending, we're also defending the hierarchy between white men and Black people, sort of this idea that there is, that there should still be segregation, that there still should be, that there is something inherently about Black people that requires them to be under authority of white people, which they read from the household codes. And at the same time, that there is also that women cannot be spiritual leaders over men. Yeah. And so these are all within that same group of people that begin this very literal understanding of the Bible. We also know that in the early part, if you think about in the 19th and the early 20th century, there's actually a lot of preaching women running around out there. You can also think about, the beginning of the Pentecostal movement.
The revivalists, totally.
There's a lot of Black women preachers actually running around out there. And so they're with the movement of inerrancy, with emphasis on inerrancy, what we also begin to see is this emphasis that women should not be in these roles, and this beginning to push women. This is sort of in some ways an early pushing women out of the pulpit in the early part of the 20th century.
Got it. Okay.
And then this comes up again in the 1970s, exactly the same thing, where we begin to see a rise of women getting ordained, women moving into these pastorates. And this is again when we see this emphasis on inerrancy, which is pulled up one more time as a trump card. It's weaponized to keep women from moving into male roles within the church, male jobs within the church.
Dang.
That was more than 2 sentences. I'm so sorry.
That's awesome. Stafford, how do you hear that?
I think that makes a lot of sense, because the things that popped in my head were with the race issues. It's obviously like the slave Bible, different things that were like ordained, so to speak, and given to help keep hierarchical compartments built. And that was like something that Christians would do and say, this is okay because we need the people to understand that they are less than. And that becomes part of the Christian culture. And then as you're going through that time period, I don't want to say it out loud because I don't have the timeline perfect in my head, but when I'm thinking through all the different feminist movements of those all line up exactly where, if I'm correct, right? Like,
yes.
So that makes sense as a reactionary thing to what's happening in culture to try to subjugate women further within each of those feminist movements.
Beverly Gaventa, who's one of my favorite Pauline scholars, and she made this wonderful statement that I haven't investigated either, but she says it's her gut that the English Bible translations at the end of the 19th century, because if you actually look at the timeline, when like Junia in Romans 16, who begins to be translated as Junius, because how could a woman be an apostle? And so they begin to translate her with a masculine name. That starts at the time of the suffrage movement at the end of the 19th century. And Beverly Gaventa hypothesized that those were connected. And I think she's probably right.
Yeah, all the eras that you just went through are all different, the different eras of feminism. So that those line up, whether it's coincidental or not, those line up, and that's
first, second, third wave.
Yep.
Dang. You know, Beth, just a couple more questions. If this is you with COVID, I cannot imagine you at full strength because you are a dynamo. This is awesome.
I feel, well, I don't know. I certainly don't feel like I'm at my full. I did put lipstick on for y'all though, because I saw myself in my Zoom seminar yesterday with my students, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I look like I'm dead."
Yeah, so. We don't. This is not a video cast, so we're all safe. What would you say to the young lady who is, older, high school, beginning college, who's been raised in the same environment you were raised in, who genuinely, desperately wants to honor God and follow Jesus and take the Bible seriously, but has been told, like you were, that this is a gospel issue and that this is these are hardened. This is how you, as a woman, honor God.
Right.
Where would you point her to start?
So I know a lot of those women.
I bet.
I was one. I'm really glad my daughter will not be one. If you think I'm a dynamo, you should see my daughter.
That's good. That's just good parenting.
She's only 11 too. So, it's something else. But so I would very gently ask, there's really two questions here. The first of all, where do you get the ideas from that women are not supposed to be leaders in the church? And, pretty much that answer is the Pauline texts of terror, which we can count on our fingers. Yeah. And so then the second question I ask is like, okay, so how do we reconcile those texts with the rest of Paul's message? What if, and so that usually is, it's like, let's take those texts and let's go to Romans 16 and let's read through Romans 16. And the problem is that after you read through Romans 16 and you see that a woman is a disciple, and you see a woman is a apostle, and you see women are house church leaders, and you see women who are, who Paul recognizes as being his co-workers and teaching alongside him. Then what if we go back to those Pauline texts of terror? How then, do we reconcile them with Paul saying women have to be silent for all time? Yeah. Either Paul is contradicting himself, which I don't think Paul is, or we've interpreted something wrongly.
Yeah.
And that usually is a starting place. Another text that I've often done is I've taken them to Martha, and Martha is a lot of fun because Martha in the medieval world is a preaching dragon slayer. who converts France along with Mary Magdalene. Oh yeah, she's a wonderful story.
Wow.
And in our world, she is an irritated domestic hostess.
Totally.
Who gets upset because nobody's helping her change the bed linens, right? So I asked them, I'm like, where do we get these ideas from? And if we look at the text of Martha, what we find is the word that is used to describe her is the same word that's used to describe the ministry of the disciples. She's described as being a deacon, as doing the deaconate work, ministry. There is the only reason we think Martha is a frustrated hostess is because, number one, Jesus goes to her home. And number two, because in Luke, we see her standing back over while Jesus is eating at their house, which is where she's sort of fulfilling the role of head of household. Which is the same role that Jesus also eats at men's houses too, same sort of thing. Everything else about Martha suggests that she's doing ministry, just like the male disciples. And so just looking at those texts help students to see that they have carried preconceptions to the text. And that what women were doing in the biblical world was much more expansive than what we have often decided that they were doing. So just thinking about that can often help them to realize that they can be faithful, because Martha was along with Peter are the only two people in the Bible who recognized Jesus as the Messiah. So I think she was faithful.
Come on. Dang, Beth, man, I am so grateful. This is such a fun conversation, and congratulations on how well the book's done.
No, thank you.
And how many opportunities you've had to talk about it. That is just fantastic. So thank you for suffering through COVID to join us. Where could people find you online?
Yeah, they can find me on Twitter, for better or for worse, I sometimes tell folk. They can also, they can find me on Instagram, which is much more fun. And they can see pictures of my family and dogs on Instagram. And my daughter and son, though, are going through a phase where they don't like me posting pictures of them. So I don't post as many because, I try to be kind to them. But you'll see them sometimes. Sometimes they give me permission. And then you can also find me. I still write on Patheos on the Anxious Bench. And so, in fact, I just had a piece on the ESV just a couple of weeks ago that got a lot of attention. So anyway, so you can find me. Those are places you can find me.
Well, Beth, thank you for your time today. We're so honored to meet you and to spotlight some of the work you're doing. So we appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. Voxology is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is supported by listeners just like yourself. If you'd like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/Voxology. You can also join the community and hang out and chat with us on the socials. Facebook.com/Voxology Podcast and on Instagram @Voxology. Thank you for walking the long road with us.